Hello, everyone, and welcome to ReadySetCyber. It's a deep dive into the challenges and solutions around business and cybersecurity. My name is Violet Sullivan, cybersecurity and privacy attorney, and also VP of Client Engagement at Redpoint Cyber. And I'll be the host today. This is fun because my LinkedIn Live doesn't look as professional as this. This is something that's sponsored by Tradeware. I'm going to introduce myself and then our guest and tell you what we're talking about today. Hopefully, we've caught you in your lunch hour, and also know, because this is so well produced, if you send a comment, it's actually going to pop up on the screen, which I have to figure out the back end of how to do that. So my background in cyber, I've been 10 years in cyber. I'm on the risk management side. I work with insurance companies and insurance carriers, insurance brokers, lawyers, and we also work on the responsive side, working in everyday cyber incidents. But I have a true academic love of all things privacy law and cyber law, and that leads us to what we're talking about today. Last week's show was a discussion around accountability and cybersecurity, and what most of us at the end of that show, most of the participants seem to agree that responsibility is on everyone, not just from the CEO to the CISO, but every single employee that touches digital devices and computers and cell phones and iPads and all of that. So our questions this time is, what are the regulations that we need to adhere to as companies? That's what we're going to focus on today. Last month, for example, we had the big SEC. I know we saw it on LinkedIn, and those new rules announced will require registrants to disclose experience and disclose, and material is going to be a big buzzword that we go into, and also to disclose on an annual basis a bunch of other material information about how they put together their risk management practices and how they govern and how they put cybersecurity into practice in the governance structure. So the commission itself also adopted rules about foreign private issuers to make similar disclosures. So there were a bunch of letters and acronyms, 8K, 10K, all of these different ones. We're going to go through them. But as the SEC chair, Gensler, said, whether a company loses a factory in a fire or millions of dollars of millions of files in a cybersecurity incident, it may be material to investors. Today's rules, the SEC rules, will benefit investors, companies, and the market connecting them. There's going to be a lot of questions out of this. So we don't want to just dig into what everyone else on LinkedIn has said. We want to have an open dialogue and conversation among the best experts. So the question for many of us today is, how can we move beyond the rules on the paper? We've already dissected what's in there. We've seen that from the SEC press release and every other person that's dissecting what it could mean. But how do we move beyond regulations and compliance and put them into practice? So I hope today's discussion will be helpful as we dive into the subject head first and talk about solutions. We have a great lineup for you today. Just a reminder, this is also being recorded, will be available on LinkedIn later and also YouTube later. And if you have any questions or comments, just type them in because they magically appear. And it's wonderful because we get to address them live. And so communicate to us, be a part of our lunch date here, the five of us together. I'm going to introduce briefly the four panelists. We have Vladimir Buyin, the cybersecurity and digital security expert here for Nestle. We have Jay Sundberg, who is a security services manager from the AME Group, Andy Runyon, a cyber specialist with Brightline Cyber Insurance, and Heath Spencer is the expert on authentication, passwordless multi-factor authentication expert and CEO of Tradeware, our wonderful sponsor for today. So welcome, everyone. Let me stop talking. Let's get very much into the discussion and say, even though we know we need to do a better job of the enforcement of regulations, and it's clear that we need to do better, we have to, are we at a place yet where we're getting some teeth now with SEC new disclosure requirements?
So I'll take a stab at that. I mean, there's some teeth. Maybe it's gums, it depends. So, their clause around the penalties are not specific. So whatever capabilities they have to enforce penalties for not adhering to their requirements, that's something to definitely be concerned about, because if they have the opportunity, they will. We were just chatting, pre-show, they're going to look to make an example of somebody, and you don't want to be that example, right? So I don't know if we fully understand what the penalties and what the teeth of the ruling are. We certainly understand the intent and where they're trying to go with it. And I think we'll see the penalties and enforcement mechanisms develop and mature as the base, as they get feedback from the industry and what's applicable. But, they're really trying to drive some federal initiatives, and the SEC is participating in this government's role of protecting this information. So I applaud them in their efforts of moving forward with that initiative and what the outcomes will be. But, do we know what they're going to do from a penalty standpoint at this point? I don't think it's written in stone at this point.
Well, you mentioned strategy, and I want to hear from someone else if you think, we saw this come out, I don't know, maybe a month after the Wells notice sent to SolarWinds, where a lot of us had to remember what a Wells notice was because of, when did they use this in the past? Do any of you think that there was strategic kind of rolling out of, we're going to show them we mean business, and we're starting with this, and then we're going to release, like the schedule of how this thing has occurred, because it also surprised people. We all thought it was going to be in October released, and here it is, August.
Vladimir, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's maybe I would like to highlight a NIS2 regulation, which is pretty much similar. It's already happening. It's highlighting the critical infrastructure and manufacturing, like Nestle, big manufacturers. And we are still listening what's happening with the NIS2, because it's still not clear. But what I like about NIS2, and in NIST, it didn't happen yet. They're already making step forward regarding AI, which is essential. For example, what's happening in the hospitals, sorry, not hospitality. We have a NIS2 regulation, which takes care of the privacy and the data of our patients, which is our most valuable data. While NIST is still thinking about that, not defining that clear. Even NIS2 didn't go too far, but something is rolling on. Both of the regulations are starting to do something, but I think technology is advancing so fast that we are really too late with any thinking more than we are doing today. Just in short, in my opinion.
I think that there's, as far as strategy goes, I think that there is some movement in that direction. I think that Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, is doing a great job of trying to steer this and then take the frameworks that she's developing through CISA and then working with organization and frameworks like NIST to create a posture that then regulatory boards like the SEC and the FTC and, in Europe, GDPR, et cetera, can all take those frameworks and map to those frameworks of what should be best practices. So I do think that there's some strategy there, and that they are aligning that strategy. And then they're trying to figure out, NIST in itself or CISA in itself don't have any leverage. They can make recommendations. They're reliant on the regulatory boards or the insurance companies, et cetera, to map to those frameworks as a strategy to then create some action or responsibility out of those frameworks.
Are they? I think they are just making a big plan to control governance. Yeah, this is a great plan. And by the way, I'm a big lover of compliance. It's not my just part of my job. But I would say what typical example is ISO 27001. They adopted last year cloud infrastructure for the first time for physical security, which I'm expert in. And everything is today in cloud data centers. It is a big business today because AI, it's the next step. So I think, again, we're already too late, but it is a good step from both sides for any of regulatory agencies to move. I think they need to move a little bit faster with decisions.
Agreed.
The same is within the companies, any enterprise company. Everything takes time with decision. Even we have a great frameworks, we can choose, pick and play. Nobody says like you have to do the NIST or you have to do the ISO. It doesn't matter. as long as you protect your data, which are your most valuable assets.
Yep.
I think the other piece that you mentioned earlier was they're going to make an example out of someone. And one of the questions I always ask when I see anyone that's in an enforcement position or some kind of regulatory body is, why don't we also make examples out of the smaller companies? Because what I see is there's like, okay, yes, that those rules apply if you're Facebook, you're Meta, and you're Google, and you're all of the ones that we've seen get hit with the GDPR fines, and we've seen all of these other regulatory issues, FTC, they're focused on these different things. To me, it makes more of an impact when they go after a small healthcare business associate, right, that had a transfer of data issue for privacy issues. So for the SEC, I would like to also see it not just be strategic on size of company, but like we mean business for every public company.
No, and Violet, that's a great point. And I mean, currently I'm at a mental health conference, and if you think about how that applies, you mentioned the healthcare unit, right? Think about a network of 7 or 8 locations, mental health care clinic or hospital network, right? They may serve 100,000 people. They're not publicly traded, right? They're not a large company. There have been examples worldwide of breaches in which the bad actor not only ransomed the healthcare provider, right, but they took the individual health records, which obviously would have incidences of schizophrenia, suicidality. I mean, these are things that can ruin people's lives if it is exposed and leveraged in the wrong way, right? So on the liability side, it's kind of a moment. I mean, to your point, one of the challenges that we face is folks think, oh, we're too rural, we're too small, right? These folks or these type of actions won't impact us. And to your point, until somebody's made an example of, or until they know somebody that has had a breach that has immediately impacted either a friend or their organization. Sometimes it's hard to get folks to understand or quantify what that liability is for the information that they hold. But it is very, very important that small to medium-sized businesses kind of pull their head out of the sand on this in 2023. This is not pre-COVID cybercrime, right? Like it's come to Main Street. It's come to the small businesses. I've told people all the time, if they'll hit a single location funeral home in Arkansas that serves a population of about 35,000 people, they'll hit anybody.
I was going to say, I've dealt with a lot of cemeteries, so there's some data there.
Well, I mean, look, they hit 5 guys making burgers, right? Like, come on. So I think Jay's going to be able to address some of this as someone who directly works with that market space. But Jay, I'd love to hear from you on how are you helping express to all of the businesses that the AME group serves that the moment they connect to the internet, doesn't matter where they're located. They're on the playing field at that point. And then how are you helping them understand? And Violet, you asked the question of why does the SEC or FTC not really go after some of the small businesses or make examples of that market? I think we're gonna see the FTC come down on some of like auto dealerships in the near future with the safeguards rule. But I think that the sidebar question of that is that they also realize there aren't 60% of those businesses that experience that incident don't survive anyway. So how can you go after them if they're not in business any longer? So Jay, what are you guys seeing on those two fronts of like addressing that 60% failure rate and helping them understand that the moment they connect to the internet, they're on the global playing field?
Sure. And this is I want to go back to something that Vladimir said, and this is regarding that. Talking about the frameworks, the government through NIST is establishing some pretty good frameworks. They're always going to be behind current technology. It's the government. I mean, they just don't move that fast. But it's up to us as the practitioners of those frameworks to adapt it, to interpret it to today's standards, to what's happening today. So that's what we do with these customers is evaluate, and we utilize the NIST cybersecurity framework as a core. That's what we build our services on. So we're looking at those things and what's the intention of that requirement? And then how does it apply to this environment that the customer has? So it's about risk, and that's where it all boils down to. For risk management practices haven't really included information systems. They've included data privacy, recently, especially.
Barely.
Yeah, exactly. But there, it's an area that needs to be addressed. So we approach it from a risk assessment standpoint. We're not risk managers, but we do help identify the risk. What's the potential impact should that risk be exploited, and what do we need to do to prevent it? And that's where we address it and how we try to make it a practical application of how to protect not only the data that you're the steward of. You have a responsibility as a steward of that information to protect it. You also have the responsibility to maintain your critical systems to make sure you can provide your services to your customers. So we have to consider both those pieces. So that's where we bring it in front of them and approach it from that standpoint. And when you put it in the terms of risk, penalties are a component of that, but the penalties, nobody seems to apply a tangible number to the penalties. It's like, I'm not going to get penalized for this. And we see it all the time in HIPAA. Violet, you mentioned that, we want to see smaller companies, face these same penalties. On the healthcare side, they do.
Yeah, right.
And
the wall of shame.
Yes, and it will put them. Yeah, it'll put them out of business. They can't support those types of those fines. And that's not the intention of these regulations, to crush industry, but we have to do a better job of protecting this information and the damage it causes. So really our focus is identifying those risks associated with that, pointing it out to the customer, giving practical applications of what you can do to mitigate those and protect that sensitive data. And you're going to get attacked. So there's, we can't avoid that, but we can limit the exposure that happens when it does occur. And that's where we focus, Heath.
So Jay, one of the questions I had for you is, there's two parts of this SEC requirement. And one is if something bad happens, an incident, a material incident that we can describe later. But I think the other thing that we're really gearing to is even just the annual requirement to show and prove that you have pre-planned activities, where before there were no annual requirements to show risk management focus on preventing cyber issues. What do you think that standard, I mean, they lay out kind of broad brush standards.
Yeah.
Where do you see that, this whole thing is about how to get to that compliance? What would you recommend for organizations to meet that standard of not just if there's a breach, but annual filings?
Right. So that all comes down to their information system security plan, right? And it's a comprehensive approach. Vladimir is going to, probably cheer, but the NIST CSF 2.0 that's coming out is going to give you a good framework on governance to manage this plan. And it's not the end all be all of guidance, but it's enough that we can practice it in a standardized approach across the U.S. economy. And actually the NIST standard is being adopted globally. So that's an area to start. Look at what the guidance that can be provided to satisfy and create a decent security plan that includes risk management, includes governance, includes vulnerability remediation. These are normal pieces of IT, I'll be honest with you. They're just not always put together in a comprehensive approach. Everybody's doing one or the other or two of the four. And this really allows us to bring it into a cohesive plan that is trying to achieve something. There's a goal in sight where when you're doing it for the sake of doing it, you lose sight of that goal sometimes. And I think that's the difference.
Well, I think I'm going to ask Andy, because one of the skill sets that I love about you is that you can kind of bring it down to the basics. And they're saying NIST all the time. And there might be people listening that don't even know where the hell to find the list for NIST, the list for NIST. Right. But if you were to break it down, and when you talk to policyholders and you have to bring this to a non-technical perspective, I usually say, hey, risk assessment, like the big buzzwords, but say risk assessment. It's just a list of questions, right? It's just going through the questions. Can you kind of list out some of the things that you would tell clients? Hey, these are going to be big things and changes, but they're not hard. And then how would you translate it?
Correct. No, and you bring up a larger point, which I think is excellent. And that's when we are client facing and we're not sitting here talking five cyber nerds together, it is extremely important that we break things down, put it in a granular basic level that's palatable to the client or to the insured for me, right? Or to even to the C-suite for, Vladimir, when he's talking to guys that may not have a cyber background. And I think that's an excellent question. I think the base thing for us that we tell people is look, if you are becoming more compliant, as you become more compliant, you also become more insurable, right? And the base ways that fleshes out, multi-factor authentication for a small business class email, right? Vulnerability management, patching your network regularly, offline tested backups, right? Incident response plans.
Incident response
Yeah, password management. What we would love to see is that your MFA potentially could eliminate that password, right, Heath?
Yes.
But these are just the basic things that are part of NIST frameworks, right? That are, oh, by the way, also now required by the FTC financial institutions. Oh, by the way, are going to be required by HIPAA, right? So the more that you push into compliance, the more insurable you become. Here are kind of the basic things to be compliant and to be insurable. And is anybody on your team, whether it's the CFO, and I mean, to Jay's point, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We have to be able to talk in dollars and cents to the CFO, right? Like we have to be able to say, hey, yeah, I mean, yes, your network is vulnerable. We've got reds and greens and yellows. But if you get hit, here's what we're looking at. This is the potential loss for your organization. But anyway, tell them, here are the base ways to become compliant. And is anybody on your team connecting those compliance measures, the investment on cybersecurity, to savings, higher limits, more appropriate coverage on the liability side?
Well, and Heath, I want to zero in on one of the check the box things, the multi-factor authentication. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is that it makes life harder and it's less efficient, and we're only going to put it on domain admins, or we're only going to put it on a certain level. And I would love to hear you describe how many places in NIST that covers, because we're talking, NIST will say you need an access use policy. Well, guess what? Guess what can help with access, right? Multi-factor authentication. Can you kind of lead us to, because to me, I see as one of those 7 birds, 1 stone is what MFA is, and especially passwordless MFA. What all different parts of the NIST requirements does that hit?
So really, MFA is most predominantly effective where there is human to application or human to device access. So it is specifically a part of an access control, right? So if you go through one of Andy's cyber insurance questionnaires or the NIST standards, it is going to define, what's interesting is Vladimir and Andy can walk into an SMB, and Vladimir at Nestle can both identify the top 6 access controls or things that you need to do, right? Between human access, application to application access, or device to application access. Mm-hmm. And identity, particularly post-pandemic, is the new perimeter. There is no more, just sitting behind the moat and castle wall, in the digital terms of firewall. And because you have remote workers, you have people working from a BYOD device on an unsecured network, and multi-factor authentication is a base requirement of a key access control today. And, people like Ann Johnson, the corporate vice president of cybersecurity at Microsoft, will scream to the hills that if you implement good MFA, not just band-aided password plus another password MFA, which we can dive into a little bit, but is that it will stop 99% of your issues. 80% of every ransomware data breach attack is tied back to some sort of password or credential misuse, where an employee, as whatever, used the same or very similar password for work as they did on a different account. That gets compromised in some other breach, and the bad actors can take that and through automated processes try it everywhere and see if they get a winner, right? And if you don't have MFA turned on, then they're instantly in, right? They can instantly get in through just using that password. And even what we're seeing today, even in big players like Uber, Twilio, others, where the attacks are sophisticated and now enough that if you're using, and I mentioned this just a second ago, two of the same factors, meaning a password, which is a shareable secret. It's a secret that only you should know, but you could share it, right? Maybe intentionally or unintentionally. And then if you get sent a temporary password, right? So a 2FA code via email or SMS or another way is also just another password. It's just a one-time use password. So you essentially have two of the same factor, not multiple factors. And you can be tricked into sharing both of those factors, right? So they're both shareable secrets. So you need to really move to, and again, Jen Easterly at CISA talks about this a lot. There's a lot of frameworks coming out of FIDO and other places where you need to move to highly phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. I'm biased because we've built a technology that is moving faster than some of the frameworks and is delivering strong authentication that happens to be passwordless by default, right? So I think we're also hearing in the industry a lot of buzzwords around passwordless, and some of those scenarios I have concerns are giving people a false sense of security because they're just creating a passwordless experience. And really the requirement, whether it's from the SEC, the FTC, or Andy's insurance questionnaire, is multi-factor authentication. So you have to deploy MFA as the access control, not a passwordless
Not just a single sign-on masked as passwordless.
No,
right.
That's not the requirement. It needs to be MFA, right, as the access control. And I'm not, I kind of went down the engineering in the weeds discussion there. Sorry.
Well,
but
we only have 3 minutes left.
Yes.
So I did have one final internal question for either Vladimir or Jay, kind of from the internal perspective, because again, the focus is how to put this into practice. How do you take, so I think the SEC annual requirement can also help if you have a breach, right? Show we were doing the right things. We were doing what we needed to do. Besides complying with industry standards and continuing to document your progress, what other things do you want the audience to think about when it comes to adjusting for these new SEC requirements? Besides just following the rules, what are some other things that they can take away?
If I may say, I think we talk too much about security controls and procedures at the end. Those are measures. Let's start with, like Jay said, with ISMS, but even more, let's start with business resilience. When I was a consultant, MSSP, how I sold my services, I was just having a stick and carrot with insurance part, which is fine. But I said, okay, what about your business? And what is your resilience of the business? We need to define, each business is different, especially enterprises like Nestle, enormous and diverse to many countries, to many regulations. Then we need to define the data and technology dependencies on the data. This is very important before we start to think about ISMS. Then we define a security technology solution for our ISMS. Then we start with ISMS. We define functionality of the ISMS, and then we go to the compliance part, which are controls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't matter. I supported 10 people company, construction company, which works with the Facebook Meta today, and they need to obey ISO 27001 certification because they deal with the data with a large company, critical infrastructure, and data center. The same approach is with them because ISMS, cybersecurity of ISMS around 90%. What about the paperwork? What about the HR, logistic? People still deal with the paper. So we need to have that kind of approach. We need to start with that. This is my opinion.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is you have got to have senior leadership support and guidance to this process. Otherwise, you're going to fail. You're going to spin your wheels, and you're going to spend more money and time than you have. Get
It's
executive
essential
sponsorship.
to have this governance and leadership from the beginning, from the senior level, management. It doesn't matter of the size of the company.
Absolutely.
Policies, standards, etc., etc. Not only jumping to a standards, we don't have a policies. It's like having a country without the constitution and making the laws.
We do have a question, but I'm not quite sure how to interpret it because it's very long and hard to read while we're on the screen.
Yeah.
I know it was something about competitive. There we go. Going against competition.
Oh, try to take out their competitors
trying to
by
take out
using
your
black hat.
competitors with black hat, which that's illegal. So
I was going to say you're breaking the law, so I would not do that.
You got the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act issue right now, or right here. So I think that would be highly illegal and ethical.
The larger point that Farley's making there is how do we drive behavior without shutting businesses down with fines, right? Like we need to find effective ways to quote unquote police this, right, or enforce it without shutting small to medium sized business down with these crushing fines. And you know, as a guy that has a coaching background, I think that you don't if a player messes up, even if he messes up egregiously. I don't know, the buzz recently, has been around this documentary on the Florida Gators football team. And Urban Meyer's taken a lot of flack over this thing, but he talked about some of his kids that messed up. He pulled the kid from his team, and the kid ended up dead within a year, right? And he said, man, look, from then on, I was not going to kick a kid off. We were going to try to rehabilitate those young men first, right? And I think that that's the key. I don't know the answer. I don't have the answer as a cyber liability guy, right, in the South. But what I do know is that instead of at the small business level, small to medium size, instead of us now saying, hey, we've shut, we've closed these doors because they weren't compliant, let's try to find kind of a medium ground. We don't want to be blasé, right? Like we don't want to just let it continue to happen. We need to work on rehabilitating and getting businesses to a place to where they are being best stewards of the data that they hold.
Well,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say both the SEC recent update and the FTC safeguards rule and others have clauses in there where they want to see you moving the right direction, right? Now, that is different. Now, if you get audited by the FTC and you can show that you're putting your best foot forward, taking steps to improve, like you just said, Andy, then they're going to accept that and they might encourage you different ways to improve quicker, right? I think that there's also a difference, though, you have a tougher job from the insurance side, because if there is an incident, and I've seen this in the real world, where someone commingled personal email with business email, they got ransomware, it led to, actually it was a wire transfer fraud situation, particularly with a real estate broker, and the court found the brokerage and the agent liable because they weren't using best practices and commingled their personal email with business email, didn't have MFA on the personal email, and it led to a 7-figure wire transfer loss, right?
Sure.
So whether that's that situation or a situation where, okay, well, let's say they had cyber insurance. Will you come in and audit that? The underwriter is going to look at it differently of like, okay, well, you were improving, but you said on your form, you have these things in place.
Right.
We're not covering you. So I think there's a balance, and this is where it falls on Jay or Vlad in their roles to then say, hey, for regulatory reasons, we need to do these things. We got to show this direction of movement. If we're filling out an insurance application, we have to make sure what we filled out, we said we did, we're doing. There's a difference between those two things.
100%. Full and honest attestation is what I always advise. Correct.
Andy, I want to tee up another insurance thing for you, though, because I think when we see the SEC, everyone's focused on the litigation issues of material. What does material mean to investors? Right. That's where everyone's focused on their law blogs. I don't know if Arrested Development fans, I always think Bob blah blah's law blog, like the old quote. But Andy, if there is coverage issues, that's another type of litigation that could happen. another year later, 2 years later,
Yep.
where do you see
Right.
there being gaps in coverage? Because this is the kind of the biggest shining light of D&O issues crossing over with cyber
Correct.
policies, and even E&O, which actually has gotten
Yep.
more expansive since cyber's a standalone.
Right.
How do all of those things start complicating the insurance, who covers what marketplace?
Sure. Now, honestly, on the accounts that we consult on most commonly, the gaps that we see right now are the funds transfer fraud that Heath mentioned. That and proper business income coverage, those can be just flat missing at times. I've consulted recently on a car dealership that was 8 figures in revenue. Ransomware sublimit to $50,000, no business income coverage, no funds transfer fraud coverage, right? And then to your point, Violet, and this is what we have to constantly bring up, and you don't want to lead with fear, but when you're dealing with the CFO, when you're dealing with a COO or a CEO, it's like, guys, we've advised you on this. I get that you don't want to pay more, but in 2023, if we just stick our head in the sand and we have this massive loss, that's going to come back, that's going to come back to you guys. That's going to, that's going to potentially be an issue on your D&O or on your board, right? Because you just stuck your head in the sand and ignored it.
Professional liability is not going to cover you. CGL
That's
is not
correct.
Going to cover
Yeah,
you.
that's not there.
To say that stuff's not going to cover you. So I think that's another area just to think about the repercussions. But going back to, I think Heath, you were saying, I can't remember who was talking about how many times Andy, carrots versus sticks, right? Like we've seen a lot of like regulation fines, putting it out, these issues, but what kind of carrots are we putting out there to help incentivize compliance to this?
I know I use a couple in particular. One is, pursuing these efforts and becoming compliant with whatever your regulatory standard is going to help you reduce your insurance costs, or give you the ability to maybe have higher limits or something. So we play it both ways on that, because that is a true benefit. If we're going to do these things, let's make sure our insurance knows about it so we can affect those policy rates.
Yeah.
But secondly, it puts a good framework of organization in place, so you've got standards to follow. People know what to do. There's less questions. It's just like having a procedural guide for building a widget. This is not too dissimilar from that. You have certain steps you're going to do. When event B happens, you're going to take step 2. Event C, you're going to take step 3, and you just follow through that process. And so it really creates a lot of efficiencies once you get through the initial, oh my God, how do I do this? And so it's definitely a benefit from an operational standpoint and as well as a financial standpoint.
Yeah, I think a lot of people understand in their real world that if they do the right things, they get better car insurance, or if they do the right things like defensible space, they get better home insurance, or those kinds of things. And how trying to transfer those analogies over to the digital world, where they still, a lot of people have this perception that it has no impact on their physical world, and yet it does. And I think that's been a big part of our job. And I'm sure that that's a huge part of your job at a big corporation like Nestle is helping them understand the physical and the digital and how they are still tied together.
It's very complex. It's a hard job to do, but I can say I'm blessed with the colleagues of the experts all over the world, and one of the best, I would say, best of the best. And we already did a convergence of OT and IoT within the industry. Yeah. We were pioneer of that, and what we are pioneering now, it's a convergence of physical security and cybersecurity, because everybody's talking about that. We are doing the work around that. It's very important, because physical access, like you said, you can have a multi-faction, but it's also related. You have authentication on the side. What about IoT devices, consumer-facing IoT devices we have? Mm-hmm. We are selling those Nescafe machines. They have internet connections, and we are also dealing with cybersecurity on that side. Yep. Why? Because it's interconnected with our systems. So this hyper-convergent interoperability, it's very, very important. This is why I said we need to think, and we need to start to think about business resilience first. how those measures are related to our business as a company.
Vladimir, I have another question, but it might be a little spicy. I feel like a lot of clients that I work with really ask me for questions about competitors' issues. The first one that always pops into mind is Mondelez, because it started with, Oreo cookie and Nabisco and all of those brands underneath the Mondelez brand had the 2017 WannaCry issue. We are still hearing about it. It's still in cover. It's still in, just had the settlement come out with a coverage issue 6 months or 8 months ago. Are you able to use that internal? You don't have to answer this exactly, but I would assume you'd be able to use that internally to help show, hey, it could be this bad, and this is why we're putting these specific measures in place.
Everybody was hit with WannaCry, and I'm not going to say what happened in Nestle, but also it happened to Nestle and every organization.
Okay.
But we were lucky because we have zero trust infrastructure. And I think I answered your question. It is a large work, this hyper-convergent of technologies. It's constantly changing within the manufacturing. And then now we are adding physical component now, which was always the worst, but it's essential to make this hyper-convergent. And you just have more workload to do and more things to check. Compliance people are really crazy with our changing of technology solutions, but we have to do that. And there is no checking the box at the end. There is no answers. When we talk about insurance at the end, I can imagine if something happens, how can you see in our environment what happened, how did it happen? It's just, I think you need to investigate for 2 next years for Nestle to figure it out what happened in the factory for any malicious activity. But if we segregate that, if we make this, let's say, if we make this organization better to segregate and then to put some zero trust environment and plus other compliance regulations, and then we double check them. Besides all of that, in Nestle, we have a hard policy that everybody needs to take care of the data.
Yeah. So Vlad,
everybody's responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, since the high level topic of this is, the SEC regulations and having board buy-in or executive buy-in, it's encouraging to me from what I'm hearing from you that it sounds like a big, one of the top companies in the world, Nestle, seems to have buy-in all the way up. I mean, how is your, I take from your demeanor and from your answers that you have executive buy-in on doing these programs from both the physical and from the digital world. And how would you encourage other companies to follow that example?
It's very hard because the physical security pillar, professionals, MSP, are selling old way of doing physical security. Yeah. I'm also IT cybersecurity person. For me, it's easier to understand, to combine them. On the other hand, we have IT people who are pretty much cocky of doing their work to say everything is an IT, cameras are IP, everything is IP. I say, no, we need to work together. And I just wrote a book. It's a promotion, a book of Convergent security. In next day, it's going to be out. Just a guideline how it works and what you need to apply from the beginning to the end if you want to make converged security system.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Violet, we can't hear you.
Yes, Mike, I muted myself so I couldn't hear the typing. Trying to keep this group on time and structured, but it's been so fun to talk with everyone. We could go on a whole nother talk about IT versus security. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I'd love to see Keith or Jay, Andy, if you have any final comments for the session on what to do compliance after these SEC regulations.
I'll just quickly say you have to do something. So start.
Don't stick your head in the sand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just get
100.
started. And then to the point of the plan, you may not have everything in place if something happens, but if you're working towards it, you can demonstrate that. That's going to significantly impact any penalties and fines. It doesn't satisfy compliance requirements, though. If you said, yes, we do it, and you're not doing it, that's a different issue. But get started and get moving on things today, and it just takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
The add-on that I would
to,
say to that is the reasonableness is the standard that's continually repeated in any court, and there's not much precedent. So if we take reasonableness and just start moving forward, I just ask to your add to your thing start is sometimes it's just starting with questions, right? A risk assessment is just questions. Asking vendors for help is just questions. You just have to get started. I agree.
And to Jay's point, all I would add is whatever it is that you do, that thing that you did, whether it was MFA, whether it was more detailed offline duo located backups, right? Whatever it may be, an IR plan. Is there somebody on your team that has a specialist on their side that can connect that investment to higher limits, better coverage, lower premiums on the liability side? Because it is an investment. You should see some return on that per the underwriting guidelines in 2023. So make sure that whatever it is that you're doing, that you're having a conversation with someone on the liability side that can benefit the organization from an insurance standpoint.
And the last thing I would say is that per these rules, you need buy-in and you need a company culture that is taking accountability and cybersecurity responsible from, the middle up and the middle down, not just from IT or not just from HR. You need a company culture where everyone is saying we're in to do better. And really, if your company culture, any business is serving a customer somehow, right? Doesn't matter. And if you're a cleaning company, but you're collecting data of your customers for billing or whatever else it is, that you're taking the mindset and the company culture that you're going to treat that with the utmost respect and take it seriously and get buy-in from every employee in that part.
Absolutely, I agree, Heath, on that. Collaboration is essential. I think every environment, especially big one, are pretty much narrow, but making a strong collaboration and agility. I always highlight agility is very, very important. We need to change. Nothing is perfect, and especially technology is changing, solutions are changing. We need to change as people. Being honest to each other, we are going to define the risk clear, and then we can pick any framework and follow any regulation. It's quite easy and simple.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been an awesome discussion. Thank you to our panelists and for all the people that joined. Thank you for the thoughts and discussion. And to our audience, thank you. If you have any further questions, we're all on LinkedIn. Happy to chat. Please reach out anytime to any of us. And also, this show is recorded and will be available on LinkedIn and YouTube. And feel free to share it with your people. Thank you for joining us, and tune in next time.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great job, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.